Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Great to have your company as always. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. Outrage as state and federal police drop their investigations into a series of hate-fuelled rants from Islamic clerics in southwest Sydney. Now, you'll recall those pro-Hamas anti-Semitic sermons. Well, somehow they don't meet the threshold of criminality. More on that with a journalist who has pursued this story tonight. More lofty words too for Bill Shorten on the NDIS, but little of actual substance when it comes to reining in the runaway spending or the rorts. No real reform, just more tax dollars on a project estimated to cost $100 billion in under a decade. Plus, we'll talk to legal expert Chris Merritt about the latest today in the federal court defamation proceedings launched by Bruce Lerman against Network 10 and Lisa Wilkinson, with more details too coming out just this evening on the payout received from the taxpayer by Brittany Higgins. And on the final sitting day of the year, the coalition went for the jugular as Labor's ineptitude on national security was exposed as a fifth released detainee was arrested in Brisbane.
Will the Prime Minister apologise to the Australian people?
The High Court ruled that indefinite detention was unconstitutional. The government must act in accordance with the law. I am sorry any time someone is a victim of a crime.
But first, with the Parliament winding up today for the year, the Albanese government is in deep trouble. And on all of Labor's usual vulnerabilities, the economy, national security, of course, above all, border protection, suddenly the Albanese government is conforming to leftist type. Given that Anthony Albanese was elected promising to be safe change and insisting that nothing much would be different except the identity of the resident in the lodge, the Albanese government is now in serious danger of becoming a oncer, especially given its obvious failure to honour the two promises it did make, namely to cut your power bill by $275 a year and to increase real wages.
Reducing power prices by $275.
By 2025, $275 a year.
$275 a year.
We'll get power prices down by $275 a year.
What's more, the reset the government urgently needs looks like being mission impossible, because unless the fundamentals change, all it will do is reset back to the same hard left agenda that's created the mess in the first place. Now, almost inevitably, what's coming is a summer of discontent for a government that's been shell-shocked ever since its defeat on the Voice referendum, and ends the year with the detainee fiasco hanging around its neck like an albatross. Now, it's typical of this government that it rammed the legislation to deal with released foreign criminals through the House of Reps almost without debate.
Oh, gutless. Gutless. You don't even want to debate it. You don't even want to debate it. This would be funny. This would be funny. This would be funny.
Order.
Except this is about keeping the Australian people safe. This is a circus. This is a circus. You're failing.
Right, that was last night. And with 4 of these detainees out and now charged, a fifth, as I said, charged today in Queensland with serious offences in scarcely the month they've been out, despite the new laws, this issue will come back and it will remind voters that Labor is soft on borders. But perhaps the worst feature of this ongoing political and policy shambles has been the Prime Minister's inability or unwillingness at any stage to actually take charge, even though the whole point of being the PM is to sort out the things that no one else can. So yes, it's clear the government needs a reset, but that can only work if there's a change to the fundamentals. And seriously, what do you think will actually change? We know energy will be an ongoing train wreck because Labor is convinced fossil fuels are destroying the planet and can't bring itself to admit that nuclear power on land might be as practical as nuclear power at sea that they just support. With uncertainty around the planned closure of the giant Eraring power station in New South Wales in just 18 months' time, widespread blackouts could readily coincide with an election year because there's no way we will have adequate 24/7 power replacement. Then there's the cost of living squeeze that the government's climate and IR policies are making worse. An Indigenous policy reset, well, that's impossible because the government is still committed to special local and regional Indigenous voices, over and above the say that Aboriginal people have, as we all do, as part of the wider community. And despite the rejection of the PM's voice, he's still locked into so-called truth-telling, with millions being spent on bodies like his Makarrata Treaty Commission, despite voters overwhelmingly voting against race-based rights. This week, there's been a series of NDIS announcements, but it sounds suspiciously like hard decisions have been put off. And the feds, well, they're just throwing more of your money at the problem. Well, how's that reform? How's that tackling the rorts? But after 18 months of the Albanese government, its biggest problem might actually be the bloke at the top. Anthony Albanese may not be a carpetbagger like Kevin Rudd or Malcolm Turnbull, two recent PMs who didn't believe in anything much perhaps, except their own destiny to be number one. Albanese's always seemed fair income about his mission in life being to fight Tories. It's just that being an effective Prime Minister requires so much more than that. You've got to have an agenda for government that most people can understand, they can relate to, and they can measure. What has this PM actually done for you so far in his time in the job, other than swan around at sporting events, spin discs on his DJ deck, and take far too many trips overseas? Now, I don't think Anthony Albanese is a bad man, but he's more in the mould of a premier than a Prime Minister. Now, you mightn't always know leadership when you see it, but like now, by God, you sure can tell when it's absent. And look, what's the point of having laws in this country against hate speech if they're not enforced against Islamist hate preachers revelling in the deaths of Jews or calling for them to be killed in Australia? First, there was the Muslim leader saying that the slaughter of Israeli civilians was a day of victory.
This is the day! Allah! What are we waiting for? Allah!
Then there was the massed chanting outside the Opera House. Then there was that preacher saying, "Kill the Jew."
To the invading Jews we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
Now, in what moral universe was it fair enough for the businessman Andrew Thorburn to resign as an AFL club CEO because of an allegedly homophobic sermon at his church, not by him, by someone else, or for Israel Folau to be dropped from the Australian rugby team for quoting scripture from the Bible? But then there's nothing, we're told, that can be done about this vile anti-Semitism at a time of maximum fear in the Australian Jewish community. Today, the Australian reports that New South Wales Police have dropped their further investigations into the Sydney cleric Abu Al-Sayed, who called on all the Muslims in the Middle East to spit on Israel so that the Jews would drown. According to a spokesman, the New South Wales Police Force understands that it does not meet the threshold of any offence. The AFP spokesman said no Commonwealth criminal offences had been identified. Now, this is reportedly the same Abu Al-Sayed whose former mosque was frequented by Australians who were later involved in terrorist atrocities in Syria, men such as Khalid Sharif and Mohammed El-Amar. If exulting in the killing of Jews and calling on Jews to be killed is not hate speech, then nothing is. And no one should accept that these deliberate and premeditated speeches are somehow the new norm in Australia. Now, I might add, where is the Human Rights Commission here? They should be saying something about this issue. If the criminal law has not been broken, Well, surely Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act has been breached. That's the law against speech that, quote, offends, insults, humiliates or intimidates on the grounds of race. How is it we have all these well-funded and well-staffed organisations that are meant to police racism, but it's only some forms of racism they're against, but not all? It's an appalling double standard, and it's no wonder that so many Australian Jews suddenly feel let down, particularly by their government and the institutions that are meant to protect them. And if you think this doesn't matter to you, you're not a Jew, well, wait until these hate preachers get back to going after everyone and anyone who doesn't believe in Muhammad, and then you might have a different view. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. Sky News political reporter Olivia Casely.
The federal government has struck a deal to pass a controversial employment law that's been vehemently opposed by the opposition and business groups. The government agreeing to split its closing loopholes bill into two parts, ensuring that before Christmas the so-called same job, same pay changes are passed, which would see labour hire workers paid the same as permanent workers. First responders will have easier access to PTSD compensation, and industrial manslaughter becomes a criminal offence, along with intentionally underpaying workers. For those who've lost loved ones to workplace accidents, it's a victory which has come at a great cost.
I believe this legislation is made through the blood of the workers.
The deal took some by surprise.
This is a breach of trust. This is not the way that a government, an Australian government, should be dealing in terms of the relationship between the business community and the government.
I don't have a problem that a deal's been done. Deals get done in this place. What I do have a problem with is the Senate had agreed that we would be able to inquire into and scrutinise this bill. We all knew that it would go through next year at some stage, but only after it had been properly scrutinised.
Changes for casual and gig economy workers won't be dealt with until next year. Amid ballooning costs, a sweeping review into the NDIS has found that the scheme should be returned to its original purpose, supporting the most profoundly disabled.
And evidence-based supports that deliver real beneficial outcomes, they're in, or in short, crystal therapies, overseas cruises and dolphins, they're out.
The shake-up will see the states chip in more, greater support outside the scheme for those with less severe needs, people on hand to help connect individuals with the right care, and a shift towards focusing more on needs rather than diagnosis. For many, the NDIS has been the only option available, but the nation's leaders want to change that.
We create a system in this country that every child gets support. I'm just agnostic about the best way to do it. NDIS, childcare, schools, other forms of support. There's enough money. The question is, could we reinvest some of those savings in a system outside the scheme so the scheme doesn't essentially become the golden ticket? It's either that or nothing.
The review recommends those external supports be available within 5 years. The states and territories agreeing to share the cost 50-50. The disability sector thinks the right balance has been struck.
I think the government has actually pulled off an extraordinary trifecta.
All right, lots to get through. It has been a very busy week in Canberra. Joining me now, the Australian's media writer, Sophie Ellsworth, and the Deputy Executive Director of the Institute of Public Affairs, Daniel Wild. Thank you both for your time. Let's start with question time today because, understandably, the opposition targeted Labor over the whole detainee fallout. We've had that fifth person today arrested in Queensland. The PM said he's sorry for anyone who's the victim of a crime. He didn't specifically want to go there and apologise for this detainee mess. And, of course, we had that legislation passed through the Parliament last night, Sophie, rushed through, no debate. All the glass jaws there on the government. They don't want to hear what they got wrong. They wanted just to put it to a vote. I have to say, though, and Peter Dutton said this the other day, Chris Merritt said it this week on the show as well, even with these new laws, the vast majority of these 148 detainees, they'll stay in the community, won't they?
Well, Peter, it appears that way, but this whole situation, the Australian public is not stupid. They can see that the government has totally messed up here. They weren't prepared for a decision that they knew was coming, and now they've had to mop up the mess that has unfolded since. So I think Australians will judge Labor very harshly on this. No one wants to feel unsafe in the community, and this appears to be a situation that they've totally mishandled, totally misjudged. They've, tried to deflect responsibility and say, we're just abiding by the decision of the court. This has been an absolute PR train wreck, and I think the government will just be relieved we're close to Christmas and hopefully they can move away from it.
Daniel, another poll out today. This is the YouGov poll, where the government's primary vote has dropped to an astounding 29%. The Coalition's at 37%. The Greens very high, worryingly high at 15%. Now, you and I know, we've been around politics enough. We know 29 primary is diabolical. This shows that news poll last week, I think it was 31 in the news poll, the primary vote for the government. It shows that that's not an outlier. This looks like it might be trend.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. It shows that news poll was pretty spot on. And as you astutely identified in your column today in The Australian at the top of the show, there's a whole myriad of self-inflicted policy problems facing the government at the moment. I think it gets to something really interesting, which is the fundamental disconnect between Labor's traditional working class voting base and the very radical left-leaning leadership of the Labor Party in Canberra. We saw with The Voice, 70% of federal Labor seats voted no. Such a emphatic public refutation of a governing party by its own voters just never happens in politics. And the policy agenda of this government is in the direct opposite to the interests of working class and lower middle income aspirational Australians, whether it's mass migration putting downward pressure on wages, energy policy that's pushing up household bills, or the ongoing cultural agenda, as you talked about, treaty and truth-telling, which is divisive and demeaning to many mainstream Australians. So I think it's going to get a lot worse for Labor over the coming months.
And I have to say the conduct of the front bench doesn't help them. And then Prime Minister's basically offered a tennis match or overseas. You've got a whole lot of arrogant MPs. Mark Dreyfus, we saw that play out yesterday. I'll ask you about that in a moment, Sophie. And then just general incompetence that we've seen play out in this detainee issue. Apparently Dreyfus has been pulled up internally over his behaviour to Sky News reporter Olivia Caisley yesterday, and I reckon so he should.
Oh, look, Peter, this is not a good look for Mark Dreyfus. Now, whatever is going on in a politician's life outside of the spotlight or whatever situation behind the scenes, they really need to keep it together when they're in front of the press pack. He did not keep it together. He became the story. Peter, you know what it's like in these roles. You have to keep your composure. You have to keep your calm. He did not do that. And what I found really interesting with this, Peter, is a lot of the media that always call out bad behaviour by the coalition, that they love to attack Conservative men, didn't do that about Mark Dreyfus. They were awfully quiet. What about standing up for women? All those people, who are always standing up for women, saying women should be treated equally. Those feminists that are usually very outspoken were very quiet during this whole fiasco. So I think it hasn't been a good situation for Labor and very hypocritical. The fact that Mr Dreyfus has been pulled aside, so he should have been. His conduct with Olivia Caisley was completely out of line.
You remind me of when Tony Abbott looked at his watch and he copped a spray from Julia Gillard, and she was defending some pretty filthy language from the Speaker of the Parliament at that time. Daniel, IR legislation got through the Parliament, at least half of it did. A lot of angry people in business, particularly small business, with this result. A deal done with the crossbench. Given where the economy is, we'll get to that in a minute, rocky times ahead, I think it's the last time it'd start to go after jobs like this.
Yeah, that's right, Peter. It's small business that will bear the brunt, as always, in addition to the resources sector and the construction sector, which are basically the linchpin of our economy. And this is occurring in the middle of a labour shortage. They're making it harder to employ Australians when we have something like 380,000 job vacancies across our country, which is 80% higher than pre-COVID. And it's also occurring in the middle of a massive slump to our competitiveness. As you and I talked about on your program a couple of weeks ago, Peter, we're plummeting down the competitiveness rankings. In 2004, we were the most resilient economy in the world. Now we're the 20th in the world, and that's being driven by red tape, regulation and declining labour productivity. And these reforms or these changes are going to add more red tape to business, which is already heavily burdened by it. As I say, make it harder to employ Australians. And you're quite right to say that this is happening at the worst possible time.
Yeah, just on that, Sophie, because you used to be a finance reporter, so you're all over this. The ABS stats this week, economic growth really, really sluggish, 0.2, so just inside positive territory. And of course, you've got this, the concerning statistics yesterday that households had saved just 1.1% of their income in September. This is the lowest sort of numbers we've seen since December 2007. Things are tight, aren't they?
Peter, you only have to talk to anyone out there. I'm in Sydney today. I was just at the train station. This older woman turned around to me and just said the cost of transport in Sydney is so expensive. People are feeling the pinch everywhere. We're seeing it across all our household bills. Mortgages, 13 rate rises in over a year has just hit so many people so hard. And I think going into Christmas, despite the fact some households still have these buffers, people are really watching their spending, because I can't see, Peter, there being any reprieve from these, tough times anytime soon. And I think going into 2024, it's going to be quite grim for a lot of households.
Yeah, there's something that turns up in politics at times like this. If they don't think the government is up to the job of looking after them, they really start to close in. I think that's where people are, even if they're just, head above water at the moment. They look at Canberra and they think this mob, they're not up to it. They're no Peter Costello there on the front bench. There's no John Howard. I better look after myself, and I'm worried about where things are headed. Daniel Wild, thanks for your time. Sophie, great to have you on the program as well. Look, before we go to the break, I just want to say something about those allegations reported in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning regarding my former Sky News colleague Alan Jones. The claims allege the inappropriate touching of 4 young men by Jones without their consent. Some men are named in the article, others are not. Alan Jones, through his lawyer, denies the allegations. He says they are scandalous, grossly offensive and seriously defamatory of him. Well, later this afternoon, his legal team issued a second statement to the effect that he has now instructed them to commence defamation proceedings. Like the other high-profile case of assault allegations involving Brittany Higgins and Bruce Lerman, it would appear that the people making the accusations against Jones have chosen to run them through the media first and not the police. Now, I think we're in a dangerous place where trial by media could end up subverting our justice system. I hope I'm wrong. But I take people as I find them, and on a personal note, I would like to address the other imputation in the newspaper story that somehow Alan Jones treats women poorly, or that he doesn't like them, or doesn't treat female co-workers respectfully. Now, in my experience, nothing could be further from the truth. In politics as a staffer, I had contact with him and it was always professional. I go as far as to say that given his own experience working for a Prime Minister, he was one of the rare people who understood the unique demands of my role. But it was working here at Sky, where I joined him each Tuesday night at the desk, that I got to know him really well. And he went out of his way, the 40-year broadcasting veteran, to help me learn the ropes. He was and is kind to a fault. He did everything he could to help me adjust to the world of TV, and I have nothing but good to say about the way he's gone into bat for me as a woman over the years. So on that, they've got it very wrong. Now, this matter's now in the hands of lawyers, so I will leave it there, other than to wish my good friend all the best. All right, after the break, anger and confusion at how state and federal investigations into these hate preachers in Sydney could be dropped. Plus, why are there now rooms being used exclusively for Indigenous people at Parliament House in Canberra? More on that shortly. Welcome back. Still to come, we'll get into those new detainee laws and concerns tonight. They do not go far enough. But now to a shocking reality check for all Australians. State and federal police have dropped their investigations into a series of hate-fuelled anti-Semitic sermons in Western Sydney, saying the cleric calls for jihad and a whole lot of stuff in relation to Jews in Israel, well, they don't meet the criminality threshold. Now, seriously, I played their comments at the top of the show. I don't know how this sort of anti-Semitic incitement does not meet the threshold. Joining me now to discuss it is the man who broke the story, New South Wales political reporter at The Australian, Alexei Dimitriadi. Alexei, thank you for your time. You broke the original story about these Islamic clerics and, of course, this follow-up today. Take us through the rationale from police, because I'm staggered, given that they're using phrases like kill the Jews, given that the day the first of these preachers went out publicly in Sydney was the day after the October 7 atrocities, long before Israel had even launched a missile. This was celebrating the death of 1,200 women, children, babies and men.
Yeah, it's you're exactly right, and thanks for having me on. It's I think I was on this show maybe a month ago when we broke the story at The Australian about these sermons, these clerics, and all the comments that you showed earlier to your viewers. We got it confirmed yesterday by both state and federal police that they'd investigated the sermons and the speeches. They'd sought legal advice, and both from a Commonwealth perspective and the AFP, the comments, the speeches didn't breach anything of the Commonwealth Code. And then here in New South Wales, the state police said that they'd also sought legal advice, and the comments that were contained in those sermons also didn't reach the threshold of criminality. The rationale behind it is, and this is something that we have covered before, and it's something that a lot of us here who are covering state politics and covering, I guess, the domestic side of the crisis, is that particularly the state-based laws, particularly both state-based and the Commonwealth laws, there's a very high threshold for criminality. And it's also a very narrow definition of what does meet that definition for then police to lay charges.
Look, I'm surprised by this because I have, in my previous life in government, listened and certainly read plenty of transcripts coming out of some of these mosques. It's not just Jews that offend some of them. It's anyone who is not Muslim, particularly Christians are attacked. I just am surprised, given that we've had cases of Israel Folau, where he quoted Bible scripture and got himself into trouble.
Yeah, there's we've got a story in the paper tomorrow, and we touched upon it in our story today. One of the things, there's a lot of outrage both in the community here in NSW, the Jewish community, but also across the political spectrum, in that this is probably the police dropping their investigations into these two clerics. It's probably the first or maybe the most high-profile practical example post-October 7 of whereby the existing laws are really being tested with practical application. So when we reported that the comments, the sermons hadn't reached that criminality threshold, the anger and the uproar, I think, is very much aimed at the situation we have whereby it appears that the existing legislation we have isn't powerful enough, isn't broad enough, rather than that,
But Alexei, let me just jump in there. I mean, I don't think anyone's complaining about the police. They're complaining about the laws the police have to operate under. But what about all those who stood outside the Opera House and chanted "Gas the Jews"? I'm not aware of any arrests or further action there either, unless you tell me I'm wrong.
As part of, I was there on October the 9th and, at the scenes of the Opera House, of course, reporting, and it was pretty striking and shocking scenes. After that, NSW police launched Operation Shelter, which is their kind of catch-all response and I guess strike force, both to the scene at the Opera House and also moving forward in relation to any pro-Palestine rallies or anti-Semitic incidents. Police have made arrests both at the Opera House and thereafter. However, in relation to, I believe, alleged common assault or anti-Semitic incidents is after October the 9th. However, they are still investigating the footage of that alleged, chance of gas to Jews. We understand from a logistical perspective, it's particularly hard because there was such a large crowd and because the force, and I'm assuming they're using other avenues as well, they're scouring through footage to try and identify both those chants, but also to pinpoint an exact person who may have shouted it, which would allow them then to charge. We've covered it.
And presumably they've got their faces uncovered. That's the other thing they need too, because part of the problem is they're turning up with their faces covered at these rallies. Well, Alexi, stay across it. We'll come back to you if there's more to report, but I don't want to drop it, particularly the issue of the clerics. Well done. All right, let's go to camera now, where we're joined by Liberal National Party Senator for Queensland, James McGrath. James, I've got you on to talk about something else that's happening around Parliament House that staggers me. Just a comment, if I can get you there, on these Islamic preachers. Pretty horrific, violent hate speech, but apparently it doesn't meet the legal threshold, either at a federal level or a state level. If it doesn't, then we've got to change it, don't we?
Oh, we've got to change it as soon as possible because it doesn't pass the pub test that people can go out and call for holy war and call for Jews to be drowned in spit, and that's not regarded as some form of extremism. But Peter, this afternoon in the Senate, Labor and the Greens set up an inquiry into right-wing political extremism. I moved amendments to it saying that it should be all forms of political extremism, neither left-wing or right-wing, but all forms of political extremism, and also religious extremism in terms of the violence that comes from that. And guess what? Labor and the Greens voted down those amendments. So this shows where the Labor and the Greens are at the moment in relation to the attacks that our Jewish communities are facing in Australia, because they only think it's right-wing extremists, when we know it's extremists at both ends of the political spectrum that need to be looked at.
Yeah, it's like Kamala Harris the other day in the White House, in and around all of these atrocities, launching a report into Islamophobia. And of course, you've got the Nazis on the far right of the spectrum, but you've got these pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas nutjobs right out there on the far left. And it's almost like they join a circle. That there's no difference between the far right and the far left on their position regarding Israel and Jews. And you're absolutely right to push for those amendments to the motion. I'm sorry to get them up. Okay, let's go to the other issue. You contacted me with some pictures. We'll put them up there for my viewers. I was gobsmacked that Parliament House is running some sort of demarcation line. I want to say apartheid, but you've got rooms now there in the building that only Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders can access. What's this about?
Parliament House should be a place of unity. It is a place that should represent all Australians, regardless of your colour, whether you've been here since the dream time or you've just been here a couple of years. And what we've seen under Labor, because they do have the wrong priorities, is they've set aside this room for just one group of Australians. That is wrong. Parliament should unite us all. And this gobsmacked you, it angered me, because this shows why it was so important for us to defeat The Voice on October 14, because what we've seen with these signs is a sign of what would have happened had The Voice got up.
So is that a permanent change? I mean, is that room set aside in perpetuity, and what's the reason for it?
I don't know what the reason for it is. I've written to the Senate President, who is Labor, and asked her for the sign to be taken down and for confirmation that all rooms in the Senate, because it's on the Senate side of the building, are open to all Australians regardless of their race.
I'm old enough to remember at the racing club, Victoria Racing Club, there was a line that women couldn't cross at the racing club. Now, that's long gone, but it was there in the 80s. I hope we're not in the position with Parliament House. Your skin colour determines what room you can walk into.
It is wrong, it is un-Australian, and that sign needs to be taken down, and I look forward to getting a response from the President.
Hey, can I call on your campaigning skill? You're a Queenslander. What odds do you give Premier Palaszczuk on surviving till the October election?
It depends if you ask Premier Palaszczuk. I think she wants to stay to the election unless there are rumours about an overseas posting that are floating around George Street. But Labor in Queensland are a rabble. You've got one side of them are trying to undermine her. She's got her people trying to protect her. And you compare them to Crucifulli and his strong team. They're united. He's come on your program. He's talked about the right priorities. The mob in Queensland, cost of living crisis, crime crisis, ambulance ramping crisis, and you've got Labor Party playing games. People are now counting it down until the election is held in October next year. And it's the same federally. We've got Labor Party in power who just don't have the same priorities as Middle Australia when it comes to looking after cost of living and keeping Australians safe.
All right, James McGrath, have a good summer break if I don't speak to you before then. Thanks for coming on the program.
Yep.
I have to say too, David Crucifulli, you reach out to him, doesn't matter where he is, he'll turn up, he'll do the show, he is hungry. And I often say if other opposition Liberals around the country worked like him, they wouldn't be in opposition. All right, after a break, that Commonwealth payout to Brittany Higgins, $2.45 million. We'll get some detail on that and the trial in a moment. Welcome back. Still to come, just one day on from those terrible international education results. We learned that a whole lot of kids, nearly 200,000 of them, are sent home early for summer break. But first to the Federal Court, where Bruce Lerman is suing Network 10 and journalist Lisa Wilkinson for defamation over an interview with Brittany Higgins on The Project in which she detailed her rape allegations. Carolyn Marcus has been following the day's proceedings in court. Big news just this evening. Here's the latest.
Brittany Higgins had earlier told the court that she'd received a payout from the Commonwealth Government of about $2.3 million. But the real figure was actually $2.45 million. The deed of settlement released by the court reveals Miss Higgins received $400,000 for hurt, distress and humiliation during her employment, $1.48 million for capital payment for loss of earnings, $220,000 for reimbursement for medical expenses and the like, $100,000 for past and future domestic assistance, and $245,000 in reimbursement. The National Anti-Corruption Commission is currently examining a complaint made over Attorney General Mark Dreyfus's handling of the government's compensation payout to Brittany Higgins. Mr. Lerman is suing Network 10 and its former star host Lisa Wilkinson over a 2021 interview on The Project in which Ms. Higgins detailed the allegations of her rape. 10 and Ms. Wilkinson say that if he was identified, they will defend the broadcast by arguing the allegations are substantially true. The trial continues.
All right, joining now, legal contributor at The Australian, Chris Merritt. Well, of course, we get the revelation this afternoon out of the federal court, Chris, that the document that sits behind that extraordinary multi-million-dollar payment from federal taxpayers, that has been released. What can you tell us?
Well, one of the most interesting aspects is why it was released. Justice Lee decided to make this public in order to resolve what he described as differences between what Ms. Higgins had told the court and the truth. And we've already heard that the figure that she received was substantially more than the amount that she'd previously disclosed. There's also a discrepancy when she said that the Commonwealth had admitted that it had breached its duty of care to Ms. Higgins. The document itself was signed and sealed on the basis of no admission of liability. But the truly astounding aspect is the treatment of Michaelia Cash and Linda Reynolds. You'll recall that these two former ministers were excluded from the mediation under threat which can only be described as financial coercion. Either they excluded themselves and didn't take part and put their point of view, or they'd have to, or the Commonwealth would not pay their legal fees. And it turns out that while the Commonwealth was immunised from further claims by Ms. Higgins, there were carve-outs specifically for Senator Reynolds and Michaelia Cash. Now, given that it also appears that the only documentation that was considered in this mediation was provided by Ms Higgins and her legal team, it raises even greater doubts about whether this passes muster, whether this complies with the rules that are set down in the government's own legal services directions. It strengthens the case, in my view, for either the National Anti-Corruption Commission to dive into this feet first, or for the Audit Office, the Auditor General, to have a look at it, or the Ombudsman, but it can't escape scrutiny. This is very smelly. There are inconsistencies that have emerged. The treatment of Michaelia Cash and Linda Reynolds seems to be reprehensible. On the one hand, they were excluded and couldn't test the claims of misconduct that were made against them. The document actually says that there was an assault. It also says that there was a toxic culture in the workplace. All these things are contested. There's never been any finding by anyone that there was an assault, that Ms Higgins was assaulted. All this is up in the air, but money was paid, and a very large amount of money. So we need an independent assessment of exactly what happened.
I couldn't agree more. I've never seen a situation, and I've worked on these cases inside government, I've never seen a situation where the direct employer of the staff are making allegations is basically prevented from testing the allegation or contesting or arguing against the allegation. That's what's happened here, and the financial sword of Damocles was held over both their heads. And of course, there's been no finding to prove any of this, but it looks like the government made the decision anyway and used the taxpayer chequebook to pay out someone sums of money, a sum that I have never, ever seen ever before in government staffing.
Look, I'll make this point. At the time, Ms Higgins was earning $78,000. This settlement, one of the reasons for this settlement is to compensate her for 40 years of employment that she could no longer carry out. So $2.45 million, if you were a factory worker in the suburbs of Melbourne and you lost a hand or an arm, I doubt whether you'd get half that amount. So I think we need to keep that
Chris, let me jump in. Let me jump in. I have a friend who works for the police force, or did work for the police force. She's now a lawyer. And she's made the point that if you've got serious assaults happening in the police force, you're lucky to get, at the highest level, under $100,000. Not dissimilar here, but this is a multi-million-dollar payout.
Yeah, there needs to be a lot more scrutiny on this. The best thing that's happened so far is Justice Lee's decision to make this available. Now, he went out of his way to be fair about this. He redacted medical details, and I think that's reasonable. But the information that's come to light, you just shake your head about it. It's so one-sided, so skewed. It can't pass muster. It needs to be thoroughly examined by an independent authority. This is taxpayers' money that went out the door.
Just before we go, Chris, do we know it is formally before the federal anti-corruption body, or is that just rumoured?
The last I heard, it had been referred to the National Anti-Corruption Commission by Senator Reynolds. As far as the Commission's internal processes go, I'd be startled if they were to confirm that this is something they're examining. It's the sort of thing that these organisations, if they do decide to examine it, they'll examine it on the sly, on quietly, let me put it that way.
All right, we'll leave it there. Chris Merritt, thank you. We'll stay across this one. As I say, I've just never seen anything like it. All right, after the break, Extinction Rebellion protesters marching in Melbourne CBD this morning. More from them and a whole lot with my panel after the break. Welcome back. Last night we talked about those international global rankings. They're called PISA, and they show that Australian teenagers today have fallen behind 2 full academic years from students who went to school in the early 2000s. Well, this morning it was revealed that almost 200,000 struggling students in years 10 and 11 are being sent home from school 2 weeks before the official start of the summer holidays. I don't know why, teachers perhaps can't be bothered, and that means they're going to miss the equivalent of 5% of this year's allocated class time, or 1 in 20 days of learning, just by going home early. Surely more time behind the desk is what's needed. To discuss this, I'm joined by former Liberal MP Nicole Flint and former President of the Victorian Liberal Party, Michael Kroger. Michael, what in earth is going wrong?
Well, Peter, educational standards in Australia, despite the money spent by Gonski and state governments over decades, educational standards are falling, as you showed last night. And the critical thing here is you get your foundation for life, your basic skills at school, you know, maths in particular, English in particular. But people leaving school 2 weeks earlier, I mean, I was gobsmacked when I read that. No, if there's anything, it needs to be 2 weeks longer, because you can't have Australia, a first world nation, continuing to have falling international standards of education. It's bad for the country, it's bad for the kids, and it's bad for our future.
Yeah, we're soft. Nicole, I was talking a bit before about the New South Wales Police dropping investigations into hate preachers. Well, we also find out today the New South Wales Police, they say they are struggling with the legal apparatus and the protocols to deal with incidents of vulnerable people, particularly the elderly, put under pressure by family members to go down the path of voluntary euthanasia. Now, whatever your views about euthanasia, no one wants to see vulnerable people in a nursing home or anywhere else put under pressure from family members who just want their money. Who's going to protect these elderly Australians?
Well, this is precisely why so many of us were opposed to these sorts of laws, Peter, because you cannot ultimately be everywhere protecting every elderly person who may be being pressured by family members, for example, to choose the euthanasia option. I do have some degree of sympathy for our police here, Peter. You know, they've had a lot on their plate. They're busy. They should be out there worrying about keeping us all safe. Instead, they're having to take on roles like this. And I want to know what the minister has been doing, and why wasn't the minister monitoring this, and why wasn't the minister working with the police in the lead up to the beginning of these laws to make sure that they were ready. So I think we need to be looking squarely at the responsible minister and saying, why have you dropped the ball, and how are you going to ensure that not one elderly person is pressured into ending their life?
Michael, COP28, we've got Chris Bowen over there. Australia signed on to 3 times the renewables by 2030 that's already in the system, so tripling our commitment. We've run away from nuclear energy, though, like it's kryptonite. And then, of course, in Victoria, out in the streets in Melbourne, to a gridlock point yet again. We've got a whole lot of these Extinction Rebellion idiots out there protesting, saying we're not doing enough.
Peter, a general comment. People are getting sick of these demonstrations all day long by the left. Extinction Rebellion, the Palestine, pro-Palestine, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic demonstrations. Goodness me, these people this morning disgraceful. But look, the good news is we've sent Chris Bowen over there. I mean, he was such a successful immigration minister. Only 1,000 people died under his watch. He was a brilliant shadow treasurer. He caused Bill Shorten to lose the 2019 election with his massive tax increase proposals. And now we've sent him over there. Well, he's just the man to completely stuff things up over there. Australia is in whatever financial position we're in today, we owe much of it to the mining industry and the farming industry, particularly the mining industry and exports. And to go over there, I presume he's going to join communicate with the other nations, saying we've got to phase out coal, gas and mining. Well, that will be a disaster. Perhaps he should go and talk to the Indians and the Chinese first, get them on board, and then see how he's going, Peter.
You are not wrong. Hey, Nicole, Opposition Leader John Pizzuto, he has now been sued with formal legal documents by Moira Deeming. You and I have both talked about this background. But he made the point in the media today that he's tried to settle this multiple times. Now, all she's ever wanted was to be put back in the party room, and that's been the sticking point. Why doesn't he just do that?
Well, precisely, Peter, and I think that if he had exhausted all options, then Moira would not be proceeding with this legal action, and she is well within her rights to clear her name and that of her family and be welcomed back into the Liberal Party room. And the opposition leader in Victoria has squandered almost an entire year on the mess of his own making.
Not wrong, Nicole Flint. Nailed it in one. Thank you for your time, Michael Crogat. Great to have your company as well. All right, that's it from me. I'm back tomorrow night. That'll be my last night. Then I'm off on my Christmas break. But right now is Andrew Bolt.